Hi, and welcome to Train Signal. We're continuing our discussion of Active Directory Advanced Services, and I'm really glad that you've joined me here because we've actually got some interesting big changes coming down to us from corporate management. We've been working here at GlobalMantics here for some number of months, and big change. Corporate headquarters sent me an email. We've been acquired by a private equity group, something called Cash Cow Capital Group. They're a big private equity group. They purchased the company, and what's important is that they want to be able to get a much better insight into our finances. They want to watch what we're doing to make sure that their investment, is profitable for them. That makes kind of sense. But of course, that's going to create some changes in IT that we need to adapt to. Even though they've got their own Active Directory environment, we don't really want to necessarily build, cross-forest trust relationships and that sort of thing, because, these kinds of equity relationships, they kind of come and go. For all we know, we might get sold to somebody else next week or 6 months from now. We don't want to make permanent, drastic changes to our architecture in a way that's going to be hard to undo. I talked to the boss, IT department manager, who wants to minimize disruption of our existing operations. We don't want to do things that's going to be hard to undo later. We also want to make sure we don't grant too much access. We do want to allow them to see into our finances environment. We've got a accounting web portal that we want to give them access to, but really not much more than that. And if we were to set up whole Active Directory cross-forest trusts, that would give them a little too much access into our environment. We really only need to give them view-only access to certain sorts of financials. Besides, if we were to try to merge our Active Directory environment with their Active Directory environment, our security team would have a fit because we'd have to open up all sorts of ports in the firewall. We're looking for something that's going to minimize the network footprint to be able to make all this work. If we can do that, we'll be heroes. The equity group will get the data that we want. My manager won't be upset that we're giving away the store. It'll be good. So we need some sort of technology to make this happen. So I figure we're probably rolling out Active Directory Federation Services, ADFS. ADFS is a way to be able to create a bridge between two organizations where perhaps they both have Active Directory. This is actually based on internet standards that would allow organizations using two totally different kinds of technology, one's running Unix, one's running Windows, to be able to share identity information. But in this case, we both got Active Directory, so that's going to make things a little bit easier. But importantly, this technology is able to bridge even that divide. But I want to reach out from my organization to theirs, or from theirs into mine. In this case, it's theirs to mine. They've got client computers. They want to get into our web-based finance portal. How do we do it? Well, I don't want to, again, set up AD cross-forest trust. That's a lot of work, and again, there's a whole bunch of security implications to that I want to avoid. I want to be able to create a light security footprint here. I want to grant access to this one server without creating a whole mess in order to make it happen. Well, luckily, ADFS is going to do that. It's going to use what's called web services. Web services are kind of the next phase of what was Windows services, continues to be Windows services. That's not an idea that's going away exactly. But you're probably aware that Microsoft runs programs behind the scenes in Windows, and those programs are able to provide access to data. You can call a computer, issue a query, some service catches that request, does some analysis, returns data to the user. Well, that's all a web service is, except it relies on internet standard web technology for the communication instead of proprietary protocols that Microsoft wrote. Specifically, ADFS rests on what's called WS security standards, web services for security, so that we can exchange data using port 80. And hey, most firewalls have port 80 open because they assume there's going to be a web server over there. There's a whole well-known security context around the use of port 80. And in many cases, of course, the use of port 443 if we're going to do HTTPS and use secure hypertext transfer protocol. That works too. So we need some mechanism to be able to describe across an organizational boundary people in one organization who should have the right to access resources in some other organization. In this case, Cash Cow Capital Group wants to get access to a web server in the GlobalMantics domain. Well, how do we do that without creating a big mess that'll be hard to undo later if we wanted to? Well, the simple solution is something called claims-based authentication or claims-based identity. The basic idea is that an Active Directory server, or one of a number of other kinds of stores of user information, contains data about users. It identifies what department they're in and what their job title is and who their manager is and a number of important, interesting pieces of data about that user. Well, a claims-based identity system can gather that information, digitally sign it with a certificate that belongs to the organization that controls that information, and send it to somebody who's relying on the information coming from that claims provider, from that source of claims information. If the receiving party looks at that data and says, yeah, that comes from an organization who I trust, this user has this name and this department and this job title, yes, I can see that that means that they should have access to this web application. Then that's a way in the door. That gives us a way to be able to validate somebody's identity without an explicit trust between Active Directory organizations, but in a way that allows us to grant access to whatever resources need to be accessible without needing to totally re-architect our Active Directory environment. And that's a very, very good idea. So our setup's going to be a little bit involved. I already talked to the guys who run the TCP/IP configuration, the network nerds. They said they've already set up like a VPN connection between our router and theirs, so that's all set. We can ping them, they can ping us, we're cool. DNS configuration, I've already handled that. I set up a conditional forwarder on our DNS server to point to their DNS server, and they've configured their DNS server with a conditional forwarder that points at ours. So we can resolve their names, they can resolve our names. And of course, we've already got our Active Directory environment set up. Again, we're not going to do a cross-forest trust. We're not going to be doing any specific changes to AD behavior on either side of this process, other than, of course, to make sure we've turned on support for claims-based authentication. That claims-based authentication idea should ring a bell. Perhaps you've been part of the lesson on dynamic access control when we talked about file system permissions tied to claims-based authentication. Same principle. I won't belabor the point here. ADFS is going to want some location to mine information from to be able to make available to the party that needs to receive this information. And that's, in a lot of cases, it's going to be Active Directory. In our case, it's going to be ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services, our domain controllers. But it could be ADLDS, Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services. This is a stripped-down LDAP database server. It's not a full-fledged Active Directory domain controller, but it acts a lot like one. But it's not part of our AD domain. It's a standalone authentication server all by itself. ADLDS itself is actually an evolution of a earlier technology called ADAM, Active Directory Application Mode. That was a standalone feature that you could install a couple of releases of the OS ago. That's now been added to the OS as a role, Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services, ADLDS. Optionally, certificate authority configuration can be part of this. In order to be able to pass data from one organization to the other in a way that the other can trust, we want to be able to wrap that data in a package that only the other side can unlock. That should sound like digital certificates to you. If you need a refresher on that, you might want to revisit the certificate authority lessons. So we can set up certificates a bunch of different ways. We can use self-signed certificates. We could use a public certificate if we've got one from VeriSign or one of the other public certificate authorities. We could even use internally generated certs with our own CA if we chose to. In this case, we're just going to take the simple approach and use self-signed certificates. I'll address some of the security implications of that decision as we get further in. So that really just leaves the important job of actually installing the software and starting the process of getting it set up. So let's jump into an installation both on the GlobalMantic side and over on the Cash Cow group side to be able to kind of see how this looks from both sides of that connection. So here I am on our GlobalMantic's ADFS server. You can see its name up here at the top there, GlobalMantic's ADFS 1. We're going to start the installation process, which of course is going to involve adding that role to this server. So I'm going to click Next to head into the wizard. I am doing a role-based installation, so our top option is right. Which server are we applying this to? GlobalMantic's ADFS 1. And there's ADFS right there near the top of the list. Checking it turns on the list of other things that ADFS wants to have installed in order to work properly, including, importantly, IIS. ADFS is implementing, again, web-based functionality, web services, to be able to drive this security interaction. So we need a web server. IIS is the Microsoft choice. Having clicked there, we can go ahead and click Next. Do we want to install any particular features? Not at the moment. I'll click Next. We're ready to start the ADFS installation process. It does point out this computer does need to be domain joined, and it is. It does insist that the Federation service and the Federation service proxy must not be the same computer. That kind of makes sense. A Federation service proxy is again an edge server, something I put in my DMZ to field the incoming requests via the internet if the connection's coming in that way. I'm going to click Next, and we get our choice of which components of ADFS to install. Up at the top of the list is the main body of Federation Services, ADFS itself. Beneath that, our choice of ADFS Web Agents. identifying whether we intend to handle claims-based communication or token-based authentication. But note in this case it's saying ADFS 1.1. That is the release that came out before ADFS, before Federation Services became part of the Active Directory family. This is for the earlier release of ADFS. So in this case, I'm not going to need any of those, but I'll turn them off in this case. Federation Service Proxy again is meant to be able to put a computer in the DMZ, in the perimeter network, and forward a request into our ADFS server inside our organization. In this case, we've got a direct network-to-network connection with our partner, our private equity organization. Therefore, no special need to set up a DMZ-hosted computer in this particular case. We're just going right from router to router. We click Next. It invites us to supply options related to the IIS installation. The default installation is going to be fine for our purposes here. So I'll go ahead and click Next here. Here's our standard summary box showing us what it is that we're preparing to install. ADFS plus IIS. Looks good. I'll click Install. And off it goes. ADFS install takes a moment here, so let me flip the switch here to put this into train signal turbo mode. Hang on just a second. There we go. Yep, there we go. So we're moving faster already. Try doing that in a sit-down class. So we've done it. We've set up an ADFS server here on the GlobalMantic side of the house. Of course, our next move will be to go call our counterpart over at the equity organization, have them set up an ADFS server on their end, because we want them to be able to build claims that then get passed over to us here so we can evaluate those. We can rely upon the claims from their ADFS organization and determine whether to provide access to some local resource, in this case our accounting web server, to those connecting in over that connection. So assuming that's been done, assuming we've installed that on the other side of the connection, now what? Well, that's actually a little bit more elaborate, so I'm actually going to go ahead and save that for a separate lesson. So we'll bring this lesson to a close, and I look forward to teaching you more about how ADFS works in another lesson.